Here we're going to examine the anatomy of the adrenal glands, as well as the hormones that they produce. The adrenal glands are pyramid-shaped glands that sit on the superior aspect of the kidney. They functionally consist of two regions, an adrenal cortex and an adrenal medulla. The adrenal cortex, which is boxed here in red, is the superficial part of the gland, while the adrenal medulla is located deep within the gland. The cortex is then further subdivided into different regions that are called zonas. The different regions of the adrenal cortex will produce and secrete different hormones. The top zone of the cortex is called the zona glomerulosa. The middle zone is the zona fasciculata, while the deeper zone, located just above the adrenal medulla, is referred to as the zona reticularis. The hormones that the adrenal cortex produces and secretes are all steroid hormones. The zona glomerulosa produces and secretes a family of hormones called the mineralocorticoids. The principal mineralocorticoid that we will focus on is aldosterone, as it is the most abundant and important one in humans. The zona fasciculata secretes a family of hormones that are collectively called the glucocorticoids. In humans, the principal glucocorticoid is referred to as cortisol. And finally, the deep zona reticularis secretes a group of hormones called the gonadocorticoids. The main hormone secreted is a weak androgen, that is, it's a male sex hormone, and it is converted to testosterone at the target tissues. However, we will also see that some estrogens are secreted as well. We'll begin with the mineralocorticoids. The mineralocorticoids are a family of hormones that regulate the electrolyte balance of the extracellular fluid. This means the tissue fluid as well as the fluid in the bloodstream. In humans, sodium is important in regulating the volume of the extracellular fluid, the blood volume, as well as the blood pressure. When sodium is reabsorbed, water is going to follow it by osmosis. This is going to function to increase blood pressure. Meanwhile, we see that potassium is important in establishing the resting membrane potential of all cells. At the zona glomerulosa, aldosterone is the most abundant of the mineralocorticoids that's produced in humans. The way that aldosterone works is that it promotes the synthesis of sodium-potassium pumps in the distal convoluted tubules as well as the collecting ducts of the kidney. These pumps work by using ATP as energy, and they pump sodium out of the filtrate and back into the bloodstream. The more sodium-potassium pumps that are within the tubules and the collecting ducts, the more sodium will be reclaimed from the filtrate and put back into the bloodstream. We also see that water follows sodium by osmosis. This prevents that sodium and water from being lost to the urine and functions to increase blood pressure and blood volume. Therefore, we see that increases in aldosterone release will equate to increased sodium and water absorption within the blood. And because of this, aldosterone also functions to increase blood pressure. But because of the way that the sodium-potassium pumps work, increases in aldosterone release equate to decreases in blood potassium levels, because the pumps will secrete potassium into the filtrate as they pump the sodium from the filtrate back into the blood. So sodium and potassium are moving through the pumps in opposite directions. This means that the potassium will ultimately be lost to the urine. So here are the major mechanisms of aldosterone release. And we'll focus on the primary mechanism, because the primary mechanism is the stimulus of decreased blood volume and decreased blood pressure. This is going to activate the renal angiotensin aldosterone mechanism, in which the kidneys will secrete the enzyme called renin, and the enzyme renin will create another enzyme called angiotensin, and angiotensin is the stimulus for the adrenal gland to secrete aldosterone. Under severe stress, more adrenocorticotropic hormone will be released from the anterior pituitary, which is going to prompt the release of more aldosterone. This will increase blood volume and pressure during stressful situations. However, when blood pressure or blood volume are too high, we will see that atrial natriuretic peptide, which is secreted from the heart, will inhibit the adrenal gland from releasing aldosterone. This allows more sodium and more water to exit the body through the urine and will function to decrease blood volume and decrease blood pressure. Aldosteronism is the hypersecretion of aldosterone that usually results from adrenal tumors. So as expected, increased levels of aldosterone will lead to increased sodium and fluid retention, which will cause edema, that is, fluid accumulation at the tissues. It will also cause hypertension, so that is high blood pressure, as well as reduced potassium in the blood and in the tissue fluid. Next, we see that the glucocorticoids are a family of hormones that influence energy metabolism, that is, energy production of most cells, and the glucocorticoids also aid in long-term stress resistance. They promote the increase of blood glucose by breaking down fats and proteins in order to use those for energy, so that the body can survive long periods of stress. In humans, cortisol is the glucocorticoid that is secreted in abundant amounts from the adrenal cortex. Other glucocorticoids like cortisone and corticosterone are secreted in very small quantities from the adrenal cortex. Glucocorticoid levels in the blood are maintained by a negative feedback mechanism, in the same way that thyroid hormone levels are maintained, as we saw earlier. The hypothalamus will secrete corticotropin-releasing hormone, which is abbreviated CRH. This will stimulate the anterior pituitary to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, and this hormone will stimulate the adrenal cortex to release cortisol. As cortisol levels begin to rise in the bloodstream, that's going to feed back to inhibit the release of CRH as well as ACTH released by the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary respectively. Cortisol levels in the blood are driven by patterns of activity as well as by eating patterns. The lowest levels in the blood are typically observed just before we go to bed at night, while the highest levels of cortisol in the blood are found in the morning when we wake. The reason for this is that cortisol helps to maintain blood glucose levels when we are fasting, that is, when we are not actively consuming food. The hormone increases blood glucose levels and also promotes the breakdown of lipids in adipose tissue in order to put fatty acids into the bloodstream. They also increase levels of protein breakdown in order to release amino acids into the bloodstream. The hormone stimulates gluconeogenesis by the liver, so that is, the liver will use those fatty acids and those amino acids in order to make glucose. Cortisol also promotes vasoconstriction in order to maintain blood pressure during stress. Excessive or elevated levels of cortisol depress bone and cartilage formation, as the hormone does promote the breakdown of proteins in these structures, as well as the skeletal muscle, in order to use those amino acids for energy. Cortisol also functions to depress the immune system and also inhibit inflammation, which is why cortisone is usually prescribed in order to reduce inflammation and inflammatory responses by the immune system. Cushing syndrome is a condition that results from the hypersecretion of cortisol. Typically, it is caused by administering too many glucocorticoid drugs, such as cortisone or prednisone, which are going to function to reduce inflammation with joint injuries, rheumatoid arthritis, or asthma. If high levels of cortisol are caused by a pituitary tumor, that is referred to as Cushing's disease. A pituitary tumor would cause the anterior pituitary to secrete high levels of adrenocorticotropic hormone, which would then stimulate the adrenal gland to secrete high levels of cortisol. Both Cushing syndrome and Cushing's disease have the same overall effects. Cushing syndrome and Cushing's disease both increase blood glucose levels by promoting the breakdown of adipose tissue and proteins. This increase in blood glucose is typically referred to as steroid diabetes, since it is caused by too much cortisol steroid. It also promotes increased sodium as well as water retention, increased blood pressure, and, as discussed earlier, depresses immune function and depresses inflammation. With Cushing syndrome or Cushing's disease, there is an unusual symptom of the redistribution of fat to the back of the neck, which creates a small bump, as seen in the before onset of Cushing syndrome on the left, and comparing that to the image after onset on the right, with the fatty bump indicated by the white arrow. The condition also causes swelling, particularly of the face, due to increased water retention. And we also see poor wound healing, which is due to the depression of inflammation as well as the suppression of the immune system. Addison's disease occurs if hyposecretion of both cortisol and aldosterone are present. This has predictable characteristics as well. So with reduced cortisol, we observe lower blood glucose levels, and with lower levels of aldosterone, this promotes lots of sodium and water loss through the urine, thereby reducing blood pressure. With Addison's disease, there is often an excess of adrenocorticotropic hormone secreted by the anterior pituitary, because the pituitary responds to the feedback of low cortisol and low aldosterone by increasing its secretion of adrenocorticotropic hormone. One very interesting symptom of Addison's disease is a bronzing of the skin. So the hand shown on the left image is someone with Addison's disease, while the hand on the right shows someone without Addison's. The melanocytes in the skin make more melanin pigment, which causes a tan-like bronzing of the skin. So in summary, long-term stressors, such as starvation or prolonged fasting, will cause the hypothalamus to stimulate the anterior pituitary and release adrenocorticotropic hormone. The hormone then stimulates the adrenal gland to secrete cortisol as well as aldosterone. Glucocorticoids such as cortisol promote the breakdown of proteins into amino acids and the breakdown of adipose tissue into fatty acids. The liver can then use the amino acids and the fatty acids in gluconeogenesis in order to create glucose for the bloodstream. Mineral corticoids such as aldosterone will stimulate the kidneys to absorb sodium and water from the filtrate and put them into the bloodstream, which will keep blood pressure high during long-term stressful events. Finally, the last group of hormones from the adrenal cortex that we're going to examine is the gonadocorticoids. Most of these that are produced by the adrenal cortex are androgens, that is, they are male sex hormones, but there are also very small quantities of estrogen-like hormones, that is, female sex hormones. Both of these categories of hormones are steroids as well. At the target tissues, the androgens that are released are converted into testosterone, while the female sex hormones that are secreted are converted into estrogen. The androgens that are made by the adrenal cortex contribute to axilla and pubic hair development in females, as well as the development of the female sex drive. The estrogens that are secreted by the adrenal cortex become the primary source of estrogens in postmenopausal women, because after menopause, the ovaries will stop ovulating, and in doing so, they will also stop producing a majority of their estrogen and progesterone. If too many gonadocorticoids are secreted from the adrenal gland, this is referred to as adrenogenital syndrome. Because the main hormone that is secreted is testosterone, this would cause females to develop masculine body hair, such as facial hair, while males will develop their secondary sex characteristics early, such as the deepening of the voice, increased growth in the skeleton, as well as increased muscle mass, and the development of facial hair. So having completed our review of the adrenal cortex, we can now examine the adrenal medulla. The cells of the adrenal medulla are actually modified neurons that belong to the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. The adrenal medulla, as mentioned in the previous slide, is composed of modified neurons called chromaffin cells that lie in close proximity to capillary beds. So during short-term stresses, like a dangerous situation, the brain will stimulate the adrenal medulla to release a set of neurotransmitters into the blood. And these neurotransmitters are collectively referred to as the catecholamines. These are actually neurotransmitters called epinephrine and norepinephrine. In this instance, because they are released into the bloodstream, these neurotransmitters are behaving more like hormones. The neurotransmitters are proteins because they're constructed from amino acids, so therefore they behave like the amino acid-based hormones. They are not steroids. Short-term stressors, so for instance, escaping a dangerous situation, will cause a cluster of neurons within the hypothalamus to stimulate and activate the adrenal medulla directly. So recall that it is the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system that controls the fight or flight response. So therefore these neurons that stimulate the adrenal medulla are sympathetic neurons. In response to stimulation, the chromaffin cells of the adrenal medulla will release epinephrine and norepinephrine in the bloodstream. It will supplement the fight or flight response that's already being controlled by the autonomic nervous system. These neurotransmitters will function to increase heart rate, as well as increasing blood pressure by constriction of the blood vessels. The bronchioles of the respiratory system will dilate to allow better oxygen delivery to the lungs. And we also see that the liver will break down glycogen into glucose and secrete that glucose into the bloodstream, therefore making glucose available as a fuel to all cells, particularly skeletal muscles as well as the brain. Hyposecretion of the catecholamines from the adrenal medulla is typically not problematic because the adrenal medulla is simply supplementing what the sympathetic nervous system is already doing in carrying out the fight or flight response. So since the catecholamines are involved in the sympathetic fight or flight response, we expect that hypersecretion of them would actually enhance and increase the effects of the sympathetic response, which predictably it does. Basal metabolic rate is increased along with heart rate, and we also see that blood pressure rises and can cause hypertension.